Who are you? Who am I? Today we are going to talk about the self, more specifically, the different perspectives of the self. So today's discussion would consist of the philosophical, anthropological, sociological, psychological, and lastly, the Eastern versus Western views or perspectives. The philosophical perspective is divided into three. We have the classical philosophers, the theological philosophers, and lastly, the modern philosophers. So how do they all come together? They all come together because they share different perspectives of the self. And this is exactly what also differentiates them from each other. As the classical philosophers ask more of the ontological questions, or the questions of what is the self? What is the being? And an example of that is when Plato said, the self is an immortal soul. And just by listening to that statement, you are able to tell that he is talking about the self. Now, comparing that to the modern philosophers who ask more of the epistemological questions, the questions of how we came to be. How are we sure that we are truly present? And going by Descartes' philosophy, he believes we are present because we think. We doubt. Just like his famous saying goes, I think, therefore I am. Now, we also have David Hume, who just completely argues that there is no self. Moving on to the theological philosophers, which can be easily distinguished away from the two, theological philosophers are heavily reliant on their philosophies on religion. An example of that is Augustine. Augustine said that knowing the self is only really through knowing God. So how do we relate these philosophers or their philosophies to ourselves? Really relate it in a way that we use them as foundations or as a guide to finding ourselves, as they have been a foundation to all their school of thought or philosophies. If I had to choose a philosopher or two, I would probably choose Socrates and David Hume, and this is why. I agree with Socrates saying that an unexamined life is not worth living, because that would mean there is no accountability. That would mean you would not know better, or you would not do better. That means that you will not reach the best version of yourself. And the other philosopher that I agree with is David Hume, who said that there is no self. I agree with this because his thought is there is no self because we are made up of fleeting sense experiences. And I agree with him that there is no permanent self, that we continuously evolve as human beings. You were different when you were 14, you are different by 25, and most definitely different by 60. So that is why I agree with him. Now, applying the philosophies of Socrates and David Hume, I could only remember myself back in junior high. Myself who didn't accept leader positions because it overwhelmed me, because I thought I was not qualified for it, without even trying it yet. And then suddenly, I was a leader in senior high. I became an org officer who had to handle both grade 11 and 12, create activities, handle the funds, and all of that. And only then I realized I do have leader qualities. That actually only through experience do I get better at being a leader. And this is how Socrates teaches me, that I could only continuously reevaluate my decisions to become better. And that I agree with David Hume, there is no permanent self, that just because I think I couldn't be a leader, I wouldn't be one.
Anthropological perspective. How one's identity is established. The study of culture and their development. Culture is shared beliefs, value, and behavior. It is integrated, symbolic, and it is learned. Culture is an ongoing event, and this process is called enculturation. Culture is complex and it is constantly evolving process. Culture has such a significant impact on a person's life. Individuals must learn and understand their culture and its contribution to society, forming their distinct characteristics. I can relate it with how we compare morals between different cultures. We might compare it to USA, for example, eating beef, but in India it is immoral. Or drinking alcohol, gambling, but in Middle Eastern Islamic countries, it is immoral. Anthropological differences cover society, location, cultures, and time. We learn more about the spectrum of potential responses to different contexts and challenges by comparing them. The two types of norms I see influence my life: folkways and laws. Folkways refers to a day-to-day behavior. Having a Filipino culture saying thank you, please, and opo is our way to respect our elders, each other, or expressing our gratitude and hospitality. Laws. Following laws maintain peace and order, and this is not hard to do. We just need to follow and obey and don't bribe anyone so just you can get away from your crime. Thank you.
The sociological perspective invites us to look at our familiar surroundings in a fresh way. It encourages us to take a new look at the world we have always taken for granted, to examine our social environment with the same curiosity that we might bring to an exotic foreign culture. The basic insight of sociology is that human behavior is shaped by the groups to which people belong and by the social interaction that takes place within those groups. We are who we are and we behave the way we do because we happen to live in a particular society at a particular point in space and time. People tend to accept their social world as unquestioningly as something natural, but the sociological perspective enables us to see society as a temporary social product created by human beings and capable of being changed by them as well. The study of sociology leads us into areas of society that we might otherwise have ignored or misunderstood. Since our worldview is shaped by our personal experience, and since people with different social experiences have different definitions of social reality, sociology helps us to appreciate viewpoints other than our own and to understand how these viewpoints came into being. Sociology also helps us understand ourselves better. Without the sociological perspective, which has been called the sociological imagination, people see the world through their limited experience of a small orbit of family, friends, and co-workers. The sociological imagination allows us to stand apart mentally from our limited experience and see the link between private concerns and social issues. It permits us to trace the connection between the patterns and events of our own and the patterns and the events of our society.
The psychological perspective of the self. Now, the idea of self from this perspective is pertained to the personality, physical appearance, and other attributes, and how we see oneself or how we would like to see ourselves among others. According to American philosopher William James, the nature of the self reflects a dual structure, which is the I and me. The I is the subjective part of the self and reflects what people see or perceive themselves doing in the physical world. On the other hand, the me is the objective part of the self and it refers to individuals' reflection about themselves. Another take comes from psychologist Carl Rogers, who proposed the notion of real self and ideal self, wherein the real self refers to what the person really is, while the ideal self is what the person aspires to be and is influenced by the person's experience and the people around. Now, in a more general sense, the psychological perspective is what I personally believe to be the most conscious and realistic perspective of how I may view the self, since it is more focused on the totality of who I am, my beliefs, attitudes, characteristics, and attributes. For instance, I am very conscious of what other people think of me, and because of that, I tend to think of what characteristics and attributes I must have that will be best for me in order to be able to gain acceptance from others and to be able to fit and become who I want to be in the first place. Now, I will discuss how I like to view myself ideally and how I will view myself in reality. So in terms of my ideal self, I like to view myself as someone who is socially confident, hardworking, unafraid of taking risks and facing challenges, persistent, and wiser in making decisions. These good qualities are what I aspire to achieve. And I think I developed this idealistic mindset because growing up, my parents and previous teachers saw these traits as something that would make me a successful and productive person who can achieve anything in life. On the other hand, as for my real self, it is somewhat far from the ideal self that I wanted to be. For starters, I am actually very shy, I'm not that wise in making choices, and I sometimes tend to be afraid of risk and challenges. But on the bright side, I am still a hardworking and persistent person, like how I ideally want to be. So basically, I have a few ideal qualities that I already have with my real self, but there are also some that I still don't. But that's okay, because the fact that I was able to identify both my real and ideal self means that I understand and am aware of who I am. And that is important if I want to improve myself and make the right choices in life.
The Eastern and Western perspective of self. The idea of self from this perspective is the notions consciousness, self-consciousness, personal identity, personality, and self overlap to a particular extent, but there exist different specific differences. The views in Western and Eastern philosophy are diametrically opposite. In the West, there exists a multitude of definitions of the self, whereas in the East, the predominant view is that the self is rather an illusion. Taking this in consideration, the issue of the status, the human self requires a new linguistic philosophical analysis in the light of both contemporary science and philosophy. Today, in neurosciences and neurophysiology, the material substrate of the self is sought in the face of the brain. Nonetheless, the use of nuclear notions is a linguistic confusion that undermines this process. In general terms, the mindset of the Eastern philosophy is oriented towards thinking in terms of society as a whole, whereas the mindset of the Western philosophy is oriented towards thinking of human beings as individuals. It is actually more complicated than that, but it does tend to be like oil and water. They don't mix too well. Moreover, the overall tendency of Eastern philosophy is to see the self as something unreal. Now, I am going to relate myself about the Western and Eastern perspective. I am a Filipino, so I have the Eastern culture. Examples of this are the attachment of family, traditional in own culture, community-oriented, good in relationships with others, and being afraid of being too long under the sun. But there are two traits that I also have in the Western culture, which is timeliness. I prepare 30 minutes before the time, and I am not fond of being late. Also, while handling problems, I tend to be frank and direct to the point. It makes it easier to point out problems and find out solutions. What is the significance of understanding the self? So understanding the self is understanding the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. It is to understand meaning, importance, and various factors related to self-concept and self-esteem. Nothing outside of yourself has any dictation on who you are and how you go about your life. When you know yourself, you will realize this, that life is so simple and that you control your own destiny. Knowing who you are will always be more important than others knowing who you are. Yourself is your sense of who you are deep down, your identity. When you let someone else know you well, you reveal your true self to them. If the subject of your thoughts is you, you're thinking about yourself, or alternately, yourself.